The House Beneath the Linden Tree. Welcome, traveler. Come a little closer to the fire and let the rain remain beyond the window. Tonight, I would like to tell you a story from the old Slavic countryside, where linden trees stand beside wooden houses, and every hearth is said to remember the hands that once warmed themselves beside it. It is a story about a forgotten cottage, a quiet guardian, and a man who returned home without knowing that the house had been waiting for him. Long ago, though perhaps not so long ago that every trace of it has disappeared, there was a small village among flat fields of rye and barley, where the horizon seemed wide enough to hold the whole sky. In spring, the ditches filled with yellow flowers. In summer, storks walked through the meadows on long red legs. In autumn, mist lay low over the fields, and in winter, smoke rose straight from the chimneys into the pale morning air. The cottage had once belonged to an old woman known throughout the village. Everyone remembered her. She had known which herbs to gather for a cough, how to mend a cracked clay pot, and when the first frost would come, simply by watching the cranes fly south. She baked dark rye bread every Thursday, and she never allowed the fire in her tiled stove to go completely cold during winter. After the old woman died, the cottage stood empty. Her only grandson lived far away in the city. He had grown up visiting the village during school holidays, but as the years passed, those visits became less frequent. First there had been work, then there had been travel, then there had simply been the habit of staying away. At last, a letter arrived from the village council. The roof had begun to leak. The garden had become overgrown. If he wished to sell the property, he should come before winter and decide what was to be done. So, on a grey afternoon in early September, her grandson left the city and traveled east. The train carried him past factories, suburbs, and wide stretches of farmland. Clouds followed him all the way. By the time he stepped down at the little station nearest the village, rain had begun to fall. It was not a storm. There was no thunder and no hard wind. It was the patient rain of early autumn, fine and steady, touching every leaf and darkening every road. A farmer with a horse cart agreed to take him the final few kilometers. He placed his suitcase beneath a canvas sheet, climbed onto the wooden seat, and watched the wet countryside move slowly past. The horse walked without hurry. Water gathered along the brim of his hat. The wheels made soft grooves in the muddy road. Somewhere beyond the fields, a dog barked once, then fell silent, and at the end of the village road, beneath a roof of rain-darkened leaves, stood his grandmother's cottage. The linden tree had grown enormous. Its trunk was broad and deeply lined, and its lowest branches reached over the roof as though sheltering the house beneath a green umbrella. Yellow leaves lay across the path. The fence leaned in several places, but the gate was still there, held closed by the same loop of wire he remembered from childhood. The farmer helped him lower the suitcase. "You will find the key with the woman next door," he said, pointing to the neighboring house. "She has been watching the place." He thanked him, and the cart continued down the road. For a moment he stood alone beneath the linden tree. Rain whispered through the leaves. The cottage windows were dark. The little wooden porch seemed smaller than he remembered. A clay pot still sat on the sill, though nothing grew in it now except moss. He felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. He had expected to feel only duty. Instead, something in the sight of the cottage loosened a knot inside him that he had not known was there. The neighboring door opened, and an old woman stepped outside beneath a black umbrella. "There you are," she called. "You have your grandmother's walk. I knew it was you before I saw your face." She was his grandmother's closest friend. She was smaller than he remembered, but her eyes were bright and clear. She took both his hands in hers, then led him into her kitchen, where a kettle steamed beside the stove. The room smelled of dried apples, wool, and warm milk. She gave him tea in a glass held by a metal basket. She asked about the city. She told him who had married, who had moved away, and which roof had fallen during the heavy snow 2 winters before. At last, she placed an iron key on the table. "The house has waited a long time," she said, and he smiled. "Houses do not mind waiting." She looked at him over the rim of her glass. "Old houses mind many things," she replied. "They simply speak more quietly than people do." He thought this was the kind of sentence village elders enjoyed giving to city people. He slipped the key into his pocket. As he stood to leave, she wrapped half a loaf of rye bread in a linen cloth and handed it to him. "Take this inside first," she said, "before your suitcase." "Why?" "Because a guest should never enter an empty house with empty hands." He raised the loaf. "But it is my house," she smiled. "Then you should be even more polite." The rain had grown softer by the time he returned to the cottage. He opened the gate, walked along the path, and climbed the 2 worn steps to the porch. The iron key resisted at first. He turned it carefully, feeling the old lock tremble beneath his hand. Then the door opened. The air inside was cool and still. It smelled of dry wood, old linen, and a faint trace of smoke that seemed impossible after so many empty years. He stood at the threshold with the loaf of bread beneath his arm. He remembered the old neighbor's warning and felt slightly foolish, but there was no one to see him. "Good evening," he said to the dark room. "I have come home." The words sounded strange, yet not unpleasant. He stepped inside. White cloths covered most of the furniture. Dust lay thick across the window sills. A spider had made a silver net between the back of a chair and the wall. He placed the bread on the table and opened the shutters. Gray light entered the room. Outside, the wet leaves of the linden tree shone against the sky. He spent the next hour carrying in wood from the shed, shaking dust from blankets, and opening windows that had been closed too long. The rain kept the air cool, but the work warmed him. At last he knelt before the stove. The iron door creaked. Inside, beneath a layer of pale ash, he found 3 small pieces of charcoal arranged side by side. He stared at them. Perhaps she had lit a fire sometime during the summer. Perhaps she had left the charcoal there without thinking. Still, the arrangement looked deliberate, almost like 3 black seeds placed carefully in the center of the hearth. He added kindling and dry birch wood. The first match went out. The second match burned steadily, and soon a small flame moved through the twigs. The stove began to warm. As evening came, the cottage changed. Shadows softened. The blue flowers on the cupboard appeared brighter. The old clock on the wall, silent for years, gave a single dry click, though its hands did not move. He ate bread with cheese at the table. Rain tapped against the window. Every now and then, water fell from a leaf onto the metal basin beside the porch with a hollow musical sound. He had planned to make a list of repairs, but he felt too tired. Instead, he found a candle, lit it, and walked through the rooms. In the bedroom, his grandmother's bed still stood beneath a woven cover. A faded picture of a guardian angel hung above it. Beside the bed was a small stool, and beneath the stool lay a pair of woolen slippers. He closed the bedroom door gently. In the workroom, most of the jars were empty. Their paper labels had faded, but he could still read a few names written in his grandmother's careful hand. Linden flower, raspberry leaf, mint, yarrow. A row of dried poppy heads stood in a blue jug. Near the floor, beside the stove wall, he noticed a tiny wooden door no larger than his hand. He crouched down. As a child, he had believed the door led to a house for mice. His grandmother had told him never to open it. "Some doors are not ours," she had said. Now the little latch was covered with dust. He smiled at the memory and left it alone. When night settled fully over the village, he prepared a bed in the main room. The bedroom felt too full of the past, so he placed a mattress on the bench near the warm stove. Before lying down, he checked the front door twice. He set the iron key on the table beside the candle. Then he listened. Rain on the roof, fire in the stove, a branch brushing slowly against the wall. He closed his eyes. For a while he slept deeply. Then, sometime after midnight, he woke to the sound of footsteps. They were very light. 3 steps crossed the floor near the stove. After a moment, 2 more steps moved toward the table. He opened his eyes. The candle had burned out, but the room was not entirely dark. A dull red glow came through the stove door. He could see the outline of the table and the pale square of the window. He held his breath. There came a soft rustle, like cloth being folded. Then silence. He sat up. "Hello?" he called, though he knew the door was locked. No one answered. He reached for the candle, found the matches, and made a light. The room was empty. The front door remained locked. The windows were closed. The cupboard doors had not moved. Only one thing was different. The loaf of bread, which he had left wrapped on the table, now rested on a wooden plate beside the stove. The linen cloth had been folded into a neat square beneath it. He stood very still. He searched for a reasonable explanation. Perhaps he had moved it before falling asleep. Perhaps he had forgotten. The journey had been long and he was tired. He touched the bread. A small piece had been broken from one end, not cut. Broken. He looked down at the floor. Near the stove in the gray dust were several marks no larger than the prints of a child's bare heel. They began beside the tiny wooden door and ended beneath the table. He felt the quiet cold of surprise move through him. Yet the room did not feel dangerous. The fire was warm, the rain was gentle. The little footprints seemed almost ordinary, as though whoever had made them had been doing the same work every night for many years. He returned the candle to the table. "I hope you liked the bread," he said softly. The stove gave a small crack. A spark moved behind the iron grate. He waited, but nothing else happened. He lay down again and pulled the blanket to his chin. This time, when he closed his eyes, he did not feel alone in the cottage. Strangely, that made it easier to sleep. Morning entered the room as a pale silver light. The rain had stopped during the night, but water still dripped from the linden leaves. A thin mist rested over the garden. Beyond the fence, the village was waking slowly. A rooster called. A bucket struck the stone edge of a well. Somewhere nearby, a woman opened a gate and spoke to her hens. He sat up and looked toward the stove. The bread remained on the wooden plate. The folded linen cloth lay beneath it. The small footprints were gone, not covered, gone. The floorboards were clean where they had been. He knelt beside the tiny door. Its latch was still dusty. There was no crack wide enough for a cat, much less a person. He placed his ear near it and heard only the faint murmur of warm air moving through the stove wall. He did not open it. Instead, he made tea and carried a cup outside. The garden had become a small wilderness. Nettles grew beside the fence. Raspberry canes tangled around the old bench. The orchard held 6 apple trees, each bent beneath small green fruit. Near the shed, a path had almost disappeared beneath grass. He spent the morning cutting weeds and clearing fallen branches. The work was simple. It asked for no meetings, no letters, and no quick answers. Each task ended clearly. A branch was moved, a hinge was oiled, a window was washed until it showed the sky again. At noon, the old neighbor came through the gate carrying a pot of potato soup. She looked at the open windows and nodded with approval. "It is breathing again," she said. He set 2 bowls on the table. For a while they ate without speaking. The soup was thick with marjoram and small pieces of carrot. Steam rose into the quiet room. At last he said, "Did you move the bread last night?" She did not look surprised. "No." "Did anyone else have a key?" "No." There were footprints by the stove, small ones. She broke a piece of bread and dipped it into her soup. "Then he has noticed you." He waited. "Who has noticed me?" "The one who stayed." She said this as calmly as if she were speaking about a neighbor. He glanced toward the little door. "My grandmother told me mice lived there." "Your grandmother told you many things in the form you were ready to hear." She placed her spoon in the bowl. "In old houses, people sometimes spoke of a house spirit, a keeper of the hearth. Some said he was an ancestor who had forgotten his name. Some said he was older than the family and belonged to the house itself. Your grandmother never claimed to know which story was true." "And she fed him bread?" A crust now and then, a spoonful of porridge, a little milk on the coldest nights. He smiled, though not unkindly. You truly believe this? She looked around the room. Belief is a large word. I know that your grandmother always left the first piece of a new loaf beside the stove. I know that when she forgot, small things went missing. A thimble, a key, a wooden spoon. I know that when she remembered, those things returned. He touched his pocket. The iron key was not there. He stood quickly and searched the table, the windowsill, and the bench where he had slept. The key had vanished. She continued eating her soup. Do not worry, she said. He dislikes doors being locked while the house is awake. The door was locked because I was asleep. The house was awake. He checked the lock. The door was closed, but no longer locked. He turned back toward the room. On top of the blue cupboard, far above his head, lay the iron key. She laughed softly. It was not a mocking laugh. It was the laugh of someone greeting an old and familiar joke. He took a chair, climbed onto it, and retrieved the key. How would anyone put it there? Carefully, she said. After lunch, she showed him how to clean the stovepipe and where his grandmother had stored spare roof tiles. Before leaving, she placed one spoonful of soup in a small clay bowl and set it near the stove. For good manners, she said. He watched her walk back through the garden. He considered removing the bowl. Instead, he left it where it was. That afternoon, the clouds lifted. A weak sunlight moved across the fields. He climbed onto the roof and replaced 3 broken shingles. From there, he could see almost the whole village. The village was a collection of red roofs, wooden barns, gardens, and narrow paths. Beyond it lay flat fields divided by rows of willow trees. Farther still, a dark line of forest rested beneath the sky. The city felt very far away. He repaired the roof until evening. When he came down, tired and covered with dust, the clay bowl beside the stove was empty. It had been washed. A drop of clean water still rested on its rim. He held the bowl beneath the window light. Then he placed it back on the floor. You are welcome, he said. That night the house was quiet. No footsteps crossed the room. No keys disappeared. The fire burned evenly, and the old clock gave another dry click. Just before he fell asleep, he heard something that might have been a sigh from behind the stove. It was the sound of someone settling comfortably into a familiar chair. During the next several days, he began to remember the rhythm of village life. Morning arrived with mist and birdsong. At noon, sunlight warmed the porch. Toward evening, smoke appeared above the chimneys, and the road filled briefly with people returning from fields and gardens. He worked on the cottage. The house seemed to help. A missing hammer appeared on the bench before he needed it. Nails that he had placed in a jar somehow arranged themselves by size. Each morning, the ash inside the stove had been swept into a neat circle, though he was certain he had left it scattered. Each morning, he told himself that he would visit the village clerk and ask about selling the property. Each afternoon, he found one more task that could not wait. Then came another day of rain. It began before dawn and continued steadily. The road became dark mud. Water ran from the roof in silver strings. The linden tree shook beneath the weight of thousands of drops. He remained indoors. He lit the stove, made buckwheat porridge, and placed the first spoonful in the clay bowl. For good manners, he said. He spent the morning sorting his grandmother's belongings. The wooden chest he remembered from childhood stood at the foot of the bed. Its brass fittings were green with age. Inside he found embroidered cloth, winter scarves, a prayer book, and several bundles of letters. The letters were not tied with blue ribbon as he remembered. They were held together with plain string, and most were addressed to his grandmother. He sat beside the window and began to read. Rain moved down the glass. Beneath the letters, he found a folded map of the village drawn in pencil. The houses were marked with family names. The pond, chapel, mill, and forest paths were carefully shown. His grandmother's cottage was marked with a small circle. From the circle, a dotted line led across the garden toward the linden tree. He turned the paper over. On the back, his grandmother had written a single sentence. What the house keeps, the roots remember. He read it twice. He carried the map to the door and looked outside. Rain covered the garden in a gray veil. The ground beneath the linden tree was dark and soft. He considered waiting until morning, but curiosity had already taken hold. He put on his coat, took a spade from the shed, and followed the dotted line. The line ended on the northern side of the trunk, where the roots rose from the soil like the backs of sleeping animals. He began to dig. At that moment, a sharp tapping came from the cottage. 3 taps again. He looked toward the house. The workroom window stood open. He was certain he had closed it. The curtain moved in the rain. Another 3 taps sounded from inside. He left the spade and hurried across the garden. When he entered the workroom, he found the little wooden door beside the stove standing open. Behind it was not a tiny room. There was only a narrow hollow between the stove wall and the floorboards, dark with soot. Inside lay a small bundle wrapped in linen. He crouched and reached toward it. The moment his fingers touched the cloth, the front door slammed shut, not violently, firmly, as though the house wished to keep the rain outside. He lifted the bundle. It contained 3 objects: a wooden horse carved by a child's hand, a silver button, and a ring of old iron keys. He recognized the wooden horse. His father had carved it when he was a boy. The silver button had belonged to his mother's winter coat. The keys were unfamiliar. Beneath them lay a piece of paper, folded many times. The writing was his grandmother's. "Do not dig beneath the linden in rain." He stared at the words. A drop of water fell from his coat onto the paper. Behind the stove came a low, impatient sound. It was not quite a growl. It was more like an old man clearing his throat. He understood. He wrapped the objects again, closed the little door, and returned to the garden. Rain ran down his face. The hole beneath the linden had already begun to collapse. He lifted the wooden box, only enough to see that it was badly rotted. One side had split beneath the pressure of the roots. Whatever it held would be safer if he did not force it open there. He covered the box with a piece of canvas, filled the loose earth around it, and placed 2 flat stones above the spot. "Tomorrow," he said. The linden leaves whispered in the rain. When he returned to the cottage, the stove fire had burned low. He added wood, changed into dry clothes, and made tea. The workroom window was closed. The clay bowl beside the stove held a single hazelnut. He picked it up. "A warning and a gift?" he asked. Something moved behind the stove. A small hand, covered in brown hair, no longer than moss, appeared briefly beneath the edge of the little door. It placed 1 finger against the floor. Then it vanished. He did not move. The tiny door closed by itself. For a long moment there was only rain. Then he began to laugh. Quietly at first, and then with the warm relief of someone who has stopped pretending that the impossible is not happening. He placed the hazelnut on the table. "Tomorrow," he repeated. From behind the stove came 1 satisfied tap. The rain ended during the night. By morning the sky was clear and pale. Drops shone on every branch. The fields beyond the village steamed gently beneath the rising sun. He ate breakfast, then carried the spade, a blanket, and the old ring of keys to the linden tree. The soil was soft, but no longer filling with water. He uncovered the wooden box and lifted it carefully from between the roots. It was smaller than he had imagined, no larger than a bread basket. Iron bands held its rotted boards together. The lock was shaped like a leaf. He tried the old keys one by one. The 5th key turned. Inside the box, wrapped in waxed cloth, was a collection of notebooks. No coins, no jewelry, no secret treasure of the kind found in old tales, only paper. He carried the box to the porch and sat beneath the linden tree. The 3rd was different. It was a record of the cottage. He read slowly. The sunlight moved across the porch boards. Near the end of the notebook, he found several pages addressed directly to him. "My dear child, if you are reading this, then the house has allowed you to find it. Perhaps you came only to sell the land. Perhaps you came because you were tired. Perhaps you do not yet know why you came. Do not feel guilty for staying away. A road is not wrong because it leads far from home. but every road should leave a place where you may return. This house has never belonged only to us. We have cared for it, and it has cared for us. The little grandfather behind the stove was here before my mother, and perhaps before hers. He is proud, easily offended, and better at finding lost things than any saint I know. Give him the first crust from a fresh loaf. Keep the hearth clean. Do not whistle indoors after sunset. Most importantly, do not promise the house anything you do not mean. He paused. As a child, he had been told not to whistle indoors, but no one had explained why. He had always assumed it was simply one of his grandmother's rules. He continued reading. There is another thing you should know. A house does not ask a person to remain forever. It asks only to be truly seen before it is left behind. If you choose to sell, repair the roof first. Light the stove for 3 nights. Tell the house where you are going. Leave bread beneath the linden tree. Then go without shame. But if you choose to stay, even for a little while, open the western shutter at sunrise. There is something I hope you remember. With all my love, your grandmother. He closed the notebook. He sat quietly beneath the tree. A bee moved among the last linden flowers high above him. Somewhere near the pond, children shouted and laughed. The village road shone after the rain. At last he carried the box inside. The western shutter was in the bedroom. It had remained closed since his arrival because a chest stood in front of it. He moved the chest aside and pushed the shutter open. Sunlight entered. Beyond the window, between the branches of the linden tree, he could see the distant line of the forest. In the foreground stood the old garden gate. Scratched into the inner surface of the shutter were dozens of marks showing the heights of children. His mother's mark was there. His uncle's mark, his father's initials, and near the bottom, beside a date from many years ago, he found the mark made for him. A line showed how tall he had been at the age of 8. Beneath it, written in his grandmother's hand, were the words, "He says he will live in this house when he is old." He placed his palm against the wood. He remembered that day. He had stood very straight while his grandmother balanced a book on his head. He had told her that he would sleep beside the stove, grow apples, and keep a horse in the shed. She had asked whether he would remember to repair the roof. He had promised. The memory came back, not as a picture, but as a complete feeling. The warmth of summer boards beneath bare feet, the smell of apple leaves, the sound of his grandmother's bracelets touching as she marked the wood with a pencil. He lowered his hand. Behind him the old clock clicked. Then it began to tick. One slow beat, then another. The hands had not been wound, yet they moved forward. He turned toward the stove. The tiny wooden door stood slightly open. Within the darkness, 2 small amber eyes watched him. They were not frightening eyes. They were tired, patient, and very old. A low voice, rough as bark, spoke a single word. "Well?" He looked around the room, at the repaired window, the clean table, the harvest braid, the clay bowl, the loaf of bread wrapped in linen. He thought about the city apartment where he often ate standing beside the sink. He thought about streets that never became quiet, clocks that always seemed too fast, and work that returned each morning exactly as unfinished as before. Then he thought about the roof. There were still several broken shingles. "I will stay until the roof is finished," he said. The amber eyes narrowed. "Only the roof?" He felt himself smile. "And the well cover." The little door opened another finger's width. "And the shed wall," he added. A small brown hand appeared and placed the missing spool of thread on the floor. He laughed. "After that," he said, "we will see." The door closed. The clock continued ticking. From behind the stove came a quiet sound that might have been approval. He stayed through September. Then he stayed through October. The roof was repaired before the first frost. The well received a new wooden cover. The shed wall was straightened with the help of the old neighbor's nephew and 2 other villagers who accepted payment in soup, bread, and a bottle of plum cordial. The cottage no longer looked empty. Smoke rose from its chimney each morning. Clean curtains hung in the windows, apples dried in thin slices above the stove. The garden path remained muddy after rain, but it was a path again. He learned the habits of the house spirit. In return for food and respect, the house spirit cared for the cottage in quiet ways. He woke the man when a spark fell from the hearth. He scratched at the wall when rain entered beneath a roof tile. He found a mouse nest in the flower cupboard and drove the mice toward the barn without harming them. As the days grew shorter, the man began working from the cottage. He placed a desk near the window and traveled to the city only when necessary. At first, he worried that the slow village would make him restless. Instead, the opposite happened. The hours became larger. He worked in the morning, repaired small things in the afternoon, and walked after supper. He learned where the cranes gathered before flying south. He learned which path remained dry after rain. He learned that the old neighbor always baked on Thursday, and that the village children would appear near the porch whenever the smell of apples came from the stove. One evening, the first frost silvered the grass. He carried wood indoors and found the house spirit sitting beside the clay bowl. For the first time, the little guardian did not hide. The house spirit was no taller than a large cat. Brown hair covered his arms and shoulders. His beard reached nearly to the floor. He wore a vest made from pieces of old cloth, each one from a different time. The man recognized part of his grandmother's green apron and a strip from one of his childhood blankets. The house spirit held a crust of bread in both hands. "Cold," he said. The man added wood to the stove. "Winter is coming." The house spirit shook his head. "Not outside." The little guardian tapped the man's chest with one small finger. The man sat on the floor. The fire brightened. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. At last the man understood that the little guardian was not asking about weather. "I have to return to the city next week," he said. "There are things I must finish." The house spirit chewed his bread. "Return?" "Yes." "Then go." The man looked toward the western window. "And the house?" The house spirit shrugged. "House knows roads." "Will you be angry?" The little guardian gave him a long, unimpressed look. "Angry if no bread, angry if wet boots, angry if whistle. Roads are roads." The man smiled. His grandmother had written the same truth in different words. The house did not ask him to remain forever. It asked only not to be forgotten. "I will come back before the first snow," he said. The house spirit pointed toward him. "Promise." He remembered his grandmother's warning. Do not promise the house anything you do not mean. He considered the journey, the work waiting in the city, and the many ways a week could become a month. Then he answered carefully, "I intend to return before the first snow. If I cannot, I will send word through the old neighbor." The house spirit nodded. This was, apparently, an acceptable promise. Before dawn the next morning, the man woke to the sound of sweeping. The little guardian was cleaning the floor with a brush made of twigs. He moved slowly, humming a tune without words. The man remained still beneath the blanket and listened. The melody felt familiar. After a while, he realized his grandmother had hummed the same tune while kneading bread. Perhaps she had learned it from her mother. Perhaps the house spirit had learned it from all of them. Or perhaps the song belonged to the house, and each person who lived there had only borrowed it for a while. He returned to the city for 9 days. The noise surprised him. Trams rang at crossings, doors opened and closed, voices moved through stairwells. Light from neighboring buildings remained in the windows long after midnight. Nothing had changed, yet he felt as though he were hearing everything for the first time. He completed his work. He met with the village clerk's representative, who had planned to discuss the sale of the cottage. Instead, he signed papers confirming that the property would remain in the family. During the final evening in the city, he carved a small wooden chair from a block of linden wood. It was not perfectly even. One leg was slightly shorter than the others, but it was made by hand, and the seat was wide enough for a creature no taller than a large cat. On the 10th morning, he traveled back to the village. The sky was low and white. Fields past the train window, empty after harvest. Bare willow branches stood beside the water channels. Here and there, smoke rose from piles of burning leaves. At the little station, the old neighbor's nephew waited with the horse cart. "You are just in time," he said. "The old women say snow is coming tonight." They reached the village in the late afternoon. The linden tree had lost nearly all its leaves. They lay gold and brown across the roof, the garden, and the road. He opened the gate. The cottage windows were dark. For one uneasy moment he wondered whether the house spirit had believed himself abandoned. Then he saw a thin line of smoke rising from the chimney. The front door opened before he touched it. Warm air met him on the porch. Inside, the stove glowed. The floor had been swept. The curtains were closed against the cold. On the table waited a wooden plate. He placed a fresh loaf of rye bread upon it. "Good evening," he said. "I have come home." Behind the stove came 3 taps. After a moment, 2 more followed. The same pattern he had heard on his first night. He unpacked his suitcase. He placed the warm socks on the table next door. He hung the brass bell beside the cottage entrance, where it gave a soft sound whenever the door moved. Finally, he set the little linden chair beside the stove. Nothing happened. He ate soup, read for a while, and added wood to the fire. Outside, the first snow began. The flakes were large and slow. They passed through the branches of the linden tree and rested on the dark earth. Soon the path became pale. The fence rails held in narrow lines of white. He opened the door and watched from the porch. The village grew quiet. The pond disappeared into darkness. Lamps shone in a few windows. Somewhere down the road, a gate closed, and then there was only snow. When he returned inside, the little chair was no longer beside the stove. It stood near the western window. The house spirit sat upon it, wrapped in a piece of red wool. He looked out at the falling snow. "Chair uneven," he said. "I know. Good wood. I hoped you would like it." The guardian ran one hand along the linden armrest. "You return." "I said I intended to." The house spirit nodded. "Better than promise." He sat on the bench. The old clock ticked. Firelight moved across the blue flowers on the cupboard. The smell of rye bread filled the room. For the first time since his arrival, he understood that returning home did not mean returning to the past. His grandmother was gone. The summers of his childhood were gone. The village had changed, and so had he. But the cottage was not asking him to become the boy he had once been. It offered something quieter, a place where the person he had become could sit beside the person he remembered, a place where old stories did not have to be proven before they were treated with respect, a place where the fire could be lit again. Winter settled over the village. Snow covered the fields, softened the roofs, and gathered in the branches of the linden tree. He remained in the cottage through December. He worked beside the western window and learned how to bake his grandmother's dark bread. His first loaf was too heavy, the second burned on one side, the third rose well and filled the house with a deep, warm smell. He cut the first crust and placed it on the wooden plate beside the stove. The house spirit appeared, lifted it with both hands, and inspected it carefully. "Acceptable," he said. Coming from him, it was high praise. The cottage had become a home again, and because it was a home, it was never perfectly quiet. Wood settled in the walls. The cattle sighed. Snow slipped from the roof. The clock ticked. The house spirit muttered when boots were left in the wrong place. Yet beneath all these sounds was a deeper stillness. It was the stillness of a place that knew who belonged there. Years later, travelers passing through the village sometimes noticed the cottage beneath the linden tree. They saw smoke rising from the chimney and warm light in the windows. If they stopped at the gate during rain or snow, the man invited them inside. He gave them tea, rye bread, and a place near the stove. He always asked them to greet the house when they entered. Some laughed. Some did not, but every guest slept well beneath that roof, and in the morning if a traveler had lost a button, a glove, a coin, or some small hope they had carried for too long, they often found it waiting beside the stove, not always in the form they expected, but waiting all the same. So now, traveler, While the fire grows quiet and the night settles around you, imagine the old cottage at the end of the village road. Imagine snow resting on the linden branches or autumn rain moving softly across the roof. Inside, the tiled stove is warm. A loaf of dark bread rests beneath a linen cloth. The clock moves slowly. Near the western window stands a small wooden chair, one leg slightly shorter than the others. And somewhere behind the stove, a patient guardian listens to the house breathe. There is no need to hurry. The road will remain until morning. The fire will keep its last ember, and the house beneath the linden tree will remember that you were here.